It is the ideology of the most powerful political faction in the US government. It caused the biggest news events of the 21st century. On July 10th, at Unregistered Academy, we will begin a two-part live interactive course on neoconservatism. We will examine the history and the ideas of the neoconservatives who remade the world. Go to unregisteredacademy.com to learn more and to sign up now. Thanks. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. My guest this week has spent his career analyzing the authoritarian nature of our political system. But he now says that that system cannot and will not last. This is my interview with Michael Malice. Are you in Austin?
I am, sir.
I am joined from Austin, Texas by one Michael Malice, well known to everyone, I think, listening and watching. Probably if you don't know who this is, you need to go check yourself or something like that. What do you say to people who don't know who you are?
That actually happened to me recently because I was at a party and someone's like, "Oh, what do you do?" So I always say media personality. I feel like that's the best because I feel like if you say podcaster, it means you've got a day job and you've got a little podcast on the side.
Right.
And if you say author, then it becomes, "Oh, what kind of books do you write?" And it becomes a discussion on your bibliography. These are both obnoxious problems to have, but they're still like I've been through enough of these conversations that I'm just like, okay, I don't really know what to say.
Media personality, like you don't call yourself an analyst or a commentator. It's personality that's important.
Well, I think doesn't media personality to me imply someone who works across different types of media.
Oh, okay.
Right. So they're on TV, they're on podcasts, they're in books. I think like Martha Stewart, although she's also like a cook, I guess you call her a decorator. I'd call her a media personality. You could shove her anywhere. She could be on Colbert. She could be on CNN. She could be on any podcast.
Sports Illustrated.
Sports Illustrated. Yeah, it's Martha Stewart doing her Martha Stewart thing.
She can handle it. No, that's right.
Jail.
No, that's totally right. And also, I don't think this is going to be a surprise to you. You have a very big personality. So, that is part of your package you bring to media, right? It's your personality is very much a part of it. It's not just your analysis.
I never appreciated that as much until recently. I was hanging out with Roseanne Barr.
Yeah.
Right. Who I grew up with. And it was the kind of thing where I'm just sitting there and I'm like, I could just listen to you talk. And people have said that about me and I never quite got it, but sitting there listening to her ramble. And even if some of the things she said, didn't make any sense or I didn't agree with it, I'm still like, I don't care. I'm here for it. Just feed me more of this beautiful, beautiful Roseanne Barr stuff. So I kind of got it, a little bit of it.
I know that's true for most of your fans. I've heard many people say that about you, that they just like listening to you talk, and it doesn't really matter too much what you say. But of course, what you do though is almost 100% analysis. When you're not cracking jokes, even those are analytical and critical, right? But you're doing analysis all the time. It's serious work.
Well, I don't think the white pill is analysis per se. I think it's more of a straight-ish history. I don't think the New Right certainly was analysis. Dear Reader was an analysis. And I think on Twitter, it's a lot of it is when I'm telling someone your mom, I don't think that's very analytical.
True. And when you make fun of me, it's not at all intelligent.
Oh, that's just facts.
Just facts, exactly. It's just well known. Well, let's talk about this book. So you have written.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. You want something? You want to say something more? Before
I'm just baffled. Like, what's behind you? Like, you seem like you're squatting behind a desk because there's an active shooter in your office. Like, why is that desk? Like, are you sitting down the floor?
I got to tell you another story before we start. So,
okay.
As I was getting ready to record this, sitting down, setting up my ring light and everything, I thought, oh, Malice is for sure going to make fun of my new studio.
But I'm confused because there's something at eye level which looks like a desk to your right.
No, it's a cabinet thing.
Oh, okay.
That's all. You never seen a cabinet before?
But I've never sat next to a cabinet.
Oh, well, I liked having it this, at eye level so we can see.
But what's behind you?
It's a door.
But so you're on the floor, like in front of a door?
No, I'm on a chair. What are you talking about? I'm in a chair. You want me to?
No, you don't have to get up. It's just like, like you're literally just sitting in front of a door.
What are you talking? So are you? There's a door right behind you, bro.
That's like 10 feet, 20, 15 feet. You're like literally, you can touch it with your head, right?
I'm relatively close to the door. Do we want to continue doing studio set analysis?
I'm just confused because you work from your laptop.
I'm sitting. Well, I have a mobile desk. I have one of those standing mobile
desks
on wheels, so I can move it around.
That makes more sense. Okay, that makes.
It is a standing desk. I can go up if you would like.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Would it be better for you? Yeah, but
it's not better. It's like a very what's that word? Sterile.
Oh yeah, no, I know. We're working on it. I am actually, honest to God, I'm about to get a new backdrop.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, you've got a lot of credentials. Your logo I like a lot.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the logo goes on the show in post.
Okay.
It's all good. Thank you for your concern about my.
I'm confused more than concerned.
Aesthetics. I don't understand that at all. But okay, let's get on with this. So speaking of being taken seriously.
Yeah.
You have written nothing less than a comprehensive history of communism in the 20th century, as well as its victims and its successful enemies. You have done something that used to be kind of a genre. I mean, I don't know if you know, like 50s and 60s, height of the Cold War, not just Solzhenitsyn, but that was the most sort of famous, but there are many versions of this. Robert Conquest, many people sort of wrote, there's another famous one I'm blanking on it right now, but many people wrote famous sort of descriptions, and I think you would agree that's primarily what you're doing in the book, descriptions of communism more or less from inside. So you're especially concerned with the way it was experienced by people, by ordinary people who lived inside of the Soviet Union and Romania, etc. Right. So there's a great deal of attention paid to the victims of it. And that's why I use that word. And you were born there. I understand that you moved here when you were a baby, so you don't have no memory of it, but your parents were Soviet citizens.
Oh, sure.
Let's start there. And I just thought of this right now. Would you consider them to be victims of communism? Because you've said that they also promoted Soviet values in the house.
Well, not Soviet values, political values, more like the idea of being suspicious of strangers. This whole American thing that, everyone's your friend is something that, people born in the Soviet Union just seems anathema. A very obvious example, I had a friend at my house, like how if I handed you an apple, Thad, you might make applesauce, you might eat it, you might plant it, whatever, but there's no possibility of you taking it and bashing it into your head. It just wouldn't enter your head. That's just crazy. In the same way, I had a friend, I've told the story before, I had a friend staying at my house. I went to the gym. And when I came back, he said, oh, like someone came by and knocked at your door asking for like Jimmy, and I sent them away. And it was just such a baffling moment because it would literally never enter my head if I'm in someone's home to answer the door. Like it's just like if I hand you an apple, you don't do that. It's like if the door knocks and I'm in someone's house, you don't answer it. But Americans don't think in those terms. So that's like one example of being raised with like a Soviet mindset. It's just incomprehensible to you that you would do things like that.
Sure.
And other things like being suspicious of authority. I don't think that's a Soviet value, but it's a value caused by being a function and being keenly aware. And this is something I think it's just shocking to me how oblivious Americans often are. And this is often to their credit. It's not a criticism of who has power over you and the certainty that sometimes people who have power over you will exercise that power just because they can. And even if it if you go to that, like I had I had an example when I had a package sent to me at the post office and the address was wrong. And, the postal worker had it and he wasn't trying to hand it over to me. And it was this whole interaction. And this happens all the time where someone has something you want. And just because you want it and they have the capacity not to give it to you, they're going to get off on withholding it for you. This is the norm, I would say, in small-minded bureaucrats, which are the overwhelming majority of bureaucrats. Americans don't think like this. Americans think, just sit down and talk with him, and then you reach a consensus. And it's just like, that to me is like Martian thinking of how people work, especially people in power who shouldn't be in a position of power. So those are some examples of kind of the Soviet mindset.
Well, wait a minute. Those attitudes all sound very useful.
They are useful.
Oh, okay. I mean, I would say that they are marked by a profound cynicism, right? Of cynicism about at least the government, power, authority figures, right? I mean, that's, I think, when I've heard this from many Soviet citizens, right?
I wouldn't call it I certainly wouldn't say it's largely exclusively a function of regarding government. I'm sure with you had the same experience with your university administrators, dealing with editors, dealing with, whoever is some bureaucrat in some edifice. On a one-on-one level, it almost becomes secondary whether this person works for the state or they work for some, for JP Morgan. They're going to function psychologically in many similar ways, although the person working for the government will probably be, all odds, a much lower quality person.
It has also been said, I think along the same lines, about people living in the Soviet Union and in the Eastern Bloc generally, that they were able to develop critical reading skills better than your average American because they knew that it was propaganda and that they had to read through between the lines.
Yes.
They had to read it with a particular critical analytical edge to it. They never assumed that what was being told to them was true. And so then when they come to new media in the United States, if they were to emigrate here, they were the ones who could read the New York Times with a critical analysis and know that there's something not being said or something being deliberately misrepresented. So again, it sounds like it's a good thing to have been a Soviet citizen.
But you just broke my brain because I had a concern in 1998 that you just addressed, and I never put two and two together. And here was the concern. When I graduated college and I was looking to get a job, I had a business degree because I knew that would be the most lucrative degree to have. I wasn't there to get an education. I was there to get a credential. I was very aware of this. And that's something I think anyone going to college should understand. The most important thing is the credential. If you want to learn philosophy, read philosophy, go online. There, you could have a much better gig. Register for Unregistered. I mean, in all seriousness. But my biggest concern was I didn't know how to speak corporate because I knew that in a business setting, people would use terms in passive aggressive ways. They would use them to give cues to you that would keep their hands clean, but you're supposed to pick up on. And I knew, I'm like, crap, I don't know how this language works. And that's a big, even kryptonite, because this is a major, major problem in any situation. If I'm in another country and I don't speak the language, we got a problem, even just figuring out where the bathroom is, right? So I never realized until you just said that this was a function of the upbringing, the understanding that never in a business or government setting is what is told to you to be accepted at face value. Because at the very least, they're choosing to talk about A instead of B. So there's got to be some reason. And the reason doesn't have to be nefarious. But there has to be, I remember when I was in college, I read an interview and Ayn Rand was attacked because she had boasted that she could defend every comma in Atlas Shrugged. And then years later, I'm like, well, of course you can defend it. She put them there. It's not like they just, spontaneously generated, punctuation, right?
Right.
So it's the same thing when someone is telling you something in a company, they're not doing it accidentally. There has to be a reason for it. And the reason is almost never the surface reason.
It's always to control you.
Yes. Or just to get ahead or whatever.
Well, that always entails control, right? You have to control the people underneath you to get ahead, right?
Sure.
So we are trained, not just in this country, in other countries as well, I am assuming, but certainly in this country, that positions, people in particular positions of authority, especially the state, teachers, all your favorite people, we're trained to think about them as members of our family effectively, right? That, Joe Biden would never do anything willfully evil against us because he's
hey. The only Uncle Joe I know is Stalin.
Right. That's my point. So I'm certainly liberals feel that way about the Democrats and Republicans feel that way about many Republicans, right? Ronald Reagan was the daddy to everybody. And there's this implicit very profound trust, right? We have in authority figures, right? The military leaders the same way. Members of the media, if you work for the New York Times, we know you're basically a good person. You might make a mistake.
I'm fighting for you.
Yeah.
Says the commercial broadcast to literally everybody. Yeah.
They might make a mistake like the Iraq War, but they mean well. They're basically good people you would have brunch with on Sunday.
Right. Unlike the other team who are evil and want to kill your children.
Right. So now
we need our team because otherwise the other team is going to kill your kids.
Right. So like in American politics broadly, we have very large families. Right?
Yes.
Very large. So that's not the case in the Soviet Union, as far as I know. And I've known many Soviets. I was in the Soviet Union in 1987, and I've known many people who lived there, right? They don't have that kind of romantic, familial relationship with authority figures, in particular members of the state apparatus in general.
Especially towards the end, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'd say always. But yeah, I mean, the existence of samizdat, all the way through, tells you a lot about it. And my experience in the Soviet Union spoke volumes about how little ordinary people thought about the Soviet state at that time. But anyway, that all seems for an anarchist, which you are, to be a really useful sort of basic attitude to have. You're always skeptical. You're basically always oppositional toward authority figures of the state.
Yes. So, and I think that's a very healthy attitude, because once you realize these are humans, and often extremely mediocre humans, and extremely mediocre humans with an agenda, a lot of what they do seems to make sense.
Totally. So the thing is, though, that I think this is right, your overarching argument in the White Pill is against cynicism.
No, it's for cynicism.
Oh.
In this context, it's this. Cynicism has different definitions, but cynicism, it was key to bringing down the Soviet Union, because at a certain point, everyone's looking around like, this is all bullshit. How do we pull the plug? Like even the people at the top, we're like, it's like a parallel example here is when supposedly when George H.W. Bush became president, he took National Review, that far right radical rag, threw it in the garbage and says, we don't need this bullshit anymore. So there's this understanding that what is being said to you in the media and by your authority figures, even they don't believe the shit that they're believing. And once that becomes understood, it's a lot harder to control a population. It's certainly a lot harder to get them to go to war, because, it's like, yeah, we don't, the Afghanistan, broke the Soviet Union as well as it took a major hit in the United States. And they knew, like, we're not going to Afghanistan to like liberate the Afghan people, or Afghan, I forgot what the correct term demonym is, but it's just like, we know this is bullshit and conquest, but like, we have to smile and nod in school and in public. So that kind of cynicism is extremely healthy. And in bringing down regimes, because they need you to buy in, because it's a lot cheaper to control you if you drink the Kool-Aid than they have to have a gun to your head, because at a certain point you run out of food to feed all the soldiers.
Right. And I don't think there's anybody who is more cynical, at least toward the state and authority figures, than Michael Malice. I mean, that's who you are, right? And so
I think there's some.
I'm up there too. I'm with you there.
Yeah, I think there's some. Yeah,
but no, but you are deeply cynical toward those figures and those institutions.
Yes.
But the book is very much against cynicism. And I've heard you give interviews in which you've said this extensively, that it's against cynicism. So it's not against political cynicism. Is that right?
Well, I mean, I don't like, it's not against personal cynicism. Personal cynicism, as I understand it, and my big hero Camus railed against this constantly, is this idea that everything sucks. The good guys never win. It's all for nothing. This kind of very 15-year-old, I listen to The Cure, shop at Hot Topic nonsense, which anarchists are often accused of. I really hate that, because while it's possible that you're not going to be, an amazing heroic figure, you can certainly be a better figure tomorrow than you are today. Yeah. You can be smarter, you can be in better shape, you could be have more friends. And I don't mean that in some kind of social calming way, but it's important to have, a good support network around you. All of us need that.
Okay.
So all of these things are mechanisms that literally everyone can improve on. But cynicism is like, what's the point? Like, right. I'm never going to be Arnold Schwarzenegger, so why go to the gym? I'm never going to be Steinbeck, why write a book? I'm never going to be president, why run for office? And it's a very lazy and easy mindset. Right. And I'm thinking specifically when Rand was on Donahue and he's trying to pin her down because she hated feminism. And it was one of the greatest owns in history. He goes, would you fight for anything? Because in his head, if you're not fighting for feminism, and she goes, how did I get here? And the audience just laughs in his face and he just walks away shaking his head. It's like, she's like, yeah, you have to fight for your values and men and women. And even if you lose, you can meet your maker, be like, hey, I did my best.
Well, and you can make your life and the world around you better in the process.
Yes.
No doubt about it. So, but it sounds like, and this might be just haggling here, but semantic haggling, but it sounds like you're writing against pessimism and maybe fatalism, not so much cynicism.
Well, yes. Well, also cynicism is the idea that everyone always is self-interested and will disappoint you. And I hate that. And that's fallacious. That's demonstrably false. I'm sure you can think of many people in your life who, when things got tough, really went to bat for you. And you were like, wow, you know what I mean? And those are the people that matter.
Yeah. So it turns out I'm more cynical than you are.
Okay.
Because I do think, and actually I learned this from libertarians. I totally learned this from libertarians not long ago, that every relationship is essentially transactional.
But that doesn't have to be have a negative connotation.
Definitely not. But there's nothing romantic or sentimental about it either. Right?
I think that I disagree. I don't think those are contradictory. If I am making someone's life better, right? That is transactional because I do anticipate they're going to make my life better, but also it is romantic because it's like I moved the needle and made things a little better in the world. So I don't think that's a contradiction at all.
Okay. But if someone does nothing for you ever in your life, or perhaps does only negative things against you, would you go out of your way to help them?
They wouldn't be in my life.
Right. Right.
But even enjoying someone's company is a major benefit.
Oh, yeah. But again, that's transactional.
Yeah, but I'm saying if someone does nothing for you, I don't know how they'd even be part of your life.
Yeah. Okay. I agree. But again, that's to me, well, I don't care about this anymore. Let's talk about communism.
But I don't think it's transactional in the sense that if I got a friend who's, having a real rough day, I'm like, hey, let's go to the movies. Let's watch TV, hang out. Let me cheer you up. I'm not doing this in anticipation or expectation that, well, because maybe that person I'm better friends with them than they are with me. Like I wouldn't rely on them, but I'm happy to do it because it's it's what it's going to cost me an afternoon of watching movies. And this person's life is fundamentally better, someone who I enjoy and like. I don't think there's a transaction there necessarily.
Yeah. I mean, there's sort of a Christian morality in there, I think, that you're talking about. There's a feeling we get.
I think it's more of an ego thing.
From doing good in the world, right?
Yes, but I make this joke, I gave talks about networking a couple of times. And the line I always say is, I do it. Like, there's this Ayn Rand joke, like, what does Ayn Rand say after giving head? I did this for me. But it's kind of like, I've
never heard that.
It's in a good one. Don't you want to be like that the concept of like existentialism, this idea that existence precedes essence and we can become the kind of person we want to be. Don't you want to be that guy who, when one of their friends is having it really rough, can make their lives better pretty effortlessly? So there is something, egotistical about it. And that is something that everyone has that power to do. You have that capacity to make people's lives better. And that also makes you the kind of person that you can look in the mirror and be like, you know what? I did pretty good today. I did the right thing.
Right. But it's always in service of one's own ego.
Sure.
Okay. That's all.
Yeah.
Well, which doesn't mean it's bad.
No, not at all.
Like I'm a Randian in that sense. I get her point there. Like I don't moralize against selfishness. I think that's ridiculous and stupid. But yeah, I hear you. Let's keep transacting right now.
Sure.
And speaking of things that are not transactional, how's this for a segue? How about international communism? Not a lot of transaction going on there over the 100 or so years it existed.
Well, there was. They had the friendship rates. This is how they bribed other countries, right?
Yeah, other communists. I know. I meant like the people like your parents. And by the way, you never answered the question. Do you consider them victims? Because it sounds like they carried forward a lot of values that they learned from the Soviet Union and from communism. They're valuable.
See, the thing with, I got into it with someone from the Atlantic because they had referred to George Soros as a Holocaust survivor, which I thought was so intellectually dishonest. And I just told him, like, listen, if you want to make George Soros into another Anne Frank, there's something they can say to you. And it's technically true because he was Jewish and in countries that were under Nazi occupation, he survived. So ergo, he's a Holocaust survivor. But people perfectly know that term implies someone who was in the camps and survived, or someone who was like in an attic somewhere and survived. So the term victim, when you think of victims of communism, I think gulags, I think murdered. In a sense, everyone was a victim that the freedoms were taken from them. But the fact that they escaped and made good lives for themselves, I would hesitate to use that term because the implication is something far more nefarious.
How about heroes instead?
Well, they're not heroes. They're certainly, I mean, it was Cernovich who had to explain to me that I'm a refugee, because the term has such a connotation of like Middle Eastern men and women and or maybe Central America. He's like, no, dude, you're a refugee. And I'm like, holy crap, I never thought of myself that way, but it's true.
You're not brown enough to be a refugee.
Yeah, but it's true. The term does have a racial coded subtext to it nowadays.
Yeah. So not victims was the answer.
I don't like that term in this context. No.
I like it. I'm with
Okay.
you. Yeah, let's get down to brass tacks here. So why did you write this fucking book about the history of communism? I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books about the history of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc and international communism and all these things. And I told you, there was a whole genre not long ago,
yes,
during the Cold War.
And I read much of them, unfortunately. It was a slog.
Yeah, right.
There were several reasons I wrote this. One of them is I am extremely hopeful about the future of the West.
Mm-hmm.
And in the circles I traveled, there was a lot of give it all up, guys. It's a wrap. Either they're too powerful. There's that whole demographic argument, which I do not find compelling at all, as I'm sure you don't as well.
Which one? Great replacement?
Or just like the demographics aren't there, but there's going to vote in the Democrats and America's over. It's just like, okay, okay. America had democratic rule for like 50 years. And there's certainly there many negative consequences, but in the sense that we're like a failed state and this is Cambodia, we got a ways to go. I think is very fair to say. Pol Pot, Cambodia specifically. And the reason why I was so hopeful wasn't some kind of Pollyanna, everything's going to be great. It's not this idea that like, have faith in God and things are going to work out in our lifetime. I was like, we've been through far worse and the victory was absolutely complete and relatively bloodless. And you can't expect the New York Times to tell the story because their fingerprints are all over it and their bloody hands all over it as well. So I'm like, all right. And I just feel like it's also, and I hate using this word in other context, a very important story. It is shocking to me that the absolute unquestioned number one foreign policy issue in America for decades is now less understood. And domestic issue too. Right. Yes, very much so.
For decades. Yeah.
For decades. And now everyone's just like, oh yeah. And it's just like, how do you not, it's just, of all the things to memory hole the Cold War, to me is I'm kind of gobsmacked that it was even possible.
And you're just talking about the United States experience,
right? Yeah,
exactly. And we barely experienced it,
Right. Yes.
But the people around the billions of people around the globe on every continent had some interaction with the Cold War in a negative way.
But they don't even teach them in Germany about like the Stasi and East Germany, like nowadays. Like even they've like memory
really?
It's crazy.
Do they?
And
really?
credit to Putin. And I'll give him credit. Gulag Archipelago is mandatory reading in Russia.
Oh, wow.
Which is really great. Wow.
That alone speaks volumes for Putin right there.
I think so.
I'm glad I already work for him. Money's great, man. That's why I have awesome studio sets because, RT. Are
you doing some kind of 1970s Berlin setup?
It's brutalist. It's brutalist studio set. That's what it is. Yeah. Thanks for noticing. Yeah. So, yeah, it's been memory hole. No one talks about the Cold War. I mean, no one talks about the Vietnam War either. No one talks about the Iraq War, for God's sake, really.
The Iraq War is discussed, I think, a lot because when people invoke, like, we need to get into Syria or whatever, they're like, okay, when Bill Kristol gets up there, it's like, all right, buddy, we tried it your way. We believed you. You don't get to do this twice.
Right. I mean, part of this, and I, 100% agree with you on this point, but I'm just saying part of it is that Americans generally are historically illiterate and uninterested in history.
Right.
And what you wrote, by the way, is I don't think there's any mention at all of contemporary politics. Not one mention.
This is what's really funny, and this is kind of maddening to me. When people are like, "Well, how does this apply to today?" I'm like, not everything is about Donald Trump. Not everything is about Joe Biden. I forget who I was talking to. No, it was Glenn Greenwald, and he was like foaming at the mouth, almost literally about how they were describing Bolsonaro as the Trump of Brazil, and he's like, not everything can be reduced to this American political binary. And if you're going to, and from his regard, he's like, Bolsonaro is this like quasi-fascist strongman. If you're going to compare talking brazenly about locking up his political opponents, but actually doing it and like taking on the judiciary, you're going to compare that to mean tweets.
Right.
It's just like you guys have no shame and also just no framework for understanding things, or Duterte in the Philippines, just complete kind of, again, everyone who's a loudmouth is Trump. It's like the problem with dictators isn't that they're loudmouths. You know what I mean? But you can't wrap your head around that if you're looking things from the American political binary.
Americans, and you and I have both been saying this for as long as we've been political people, are idiots. I mean, politically, I mean, generally speaking, Americans don't know anything.
Thad, if you try to sit down to Americans and conservatives and explain to them that socialism in the United States came in the back door through Christianity, that Christian socialism is what brought it in here, that the most religious president we've ever had was the most evil Woodrow Wilson, and the hardcore progressive. But they don't understand, because in their heads, Christian means conservative, which means Republican, and these three terms are interchangeable. And if you try to explain any of this to them, they cannot wrap their heads around it.
Boom. Yes, you and I have
wrong?
been saying, no, well, you and I have been saying also for decades, independently, it turned out, that socialism is a product of Christianity.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I think socialism was no. Socialism was a reaction against Christianity.
Well, what did you just say though about sneaking socialism?
No, in American
socialism. Oh well, no, here, the American left has been fundamentally a Christian enterprise since the beginning, including progressivism, the semi-socialists.
A cross, man shall not be crucified on a cross of gold. That's the 1890s.
William Jennings Bryan.
Yes.
Yeah. But they all spoke like that. They all spoke in Christian and socialist terms. When I read the Bible, when I was a socialist in college, I said, oh my God, Jesus is my boy. He's a socialist. What's the problem?
And they didn't mean Christians in the modern lip service, Kamala Harris, I'm a believer. These were very pious, hate pleasure, go to church, very much took it seriously. This wasn't lip service to them. They lived the lifestyle.
They sure did. All the suffragettes and the abolitionists and the progressives and the socialists and the communists all lived like monks. Or nuns, all of them. Absolutely. All right. So you wrote this book because the frickin', not just the Cold War, but communism has been memory hold, despite the fact that it was undoubtedly the most important, I guess, event of the entire 20th century. And as I said, globally, not just in Russia and America, all around the world. So yes, I agree. Let's talk a minute about why that is. Why we don't talk about communism, the Soviet Union, the evils of Stalin, the Holodomor, all those things at all. Why do you think?
I think because the narrative is messy. Because if Stalin is a bad guy, then World War II suddenly doesn't become good versus evil. It becomes good and evil versus evil. And we don't like that because we want everything to be reduced to WWE, where it's the good guys versus bad guys. Axis good, Axis bad, excuse me, Freudian slip, allies good. Also, the fact that Reagan and Thatcher had such a strong part to play in bringing down the Soviet Union. Well, we can't have any story that where they're in any sense portrayed as anything other than, malevolent monsters. And you can't, and despite the claims to the contrary, conservatives are violently disinterested in history. The argument is conservatism is about learning the lessons of history and applying them to today. If you look at any conservative pundit, they're far more interested in talking about Dylan Mulvaney than they are in talking about Woodrow Wilson or LBJ.
That's for sure.
And it's a very ahistoric mindset where, this is one of the things I was arguing against in the book with receipts, is you see this over and over with boomer conservatives, that things used to be great until 30 years ago, and it's always 30 years ago when they were kids. The left, as if it's this monolith, the left, took over these institutions. And it's like, at the same time, they're aware that the reason Ronald Reagan met Nancy Reagan is there was an actress with the same name, Nancy Davis, who was accused of being a communist, and she went to talk to him to clear her name up. So they understand that in the 30s, Hollywood is being run by not just people who were like, a philosophically communist, but literal Stalinists, taking orders from Moscow. But somehow things got bad in the 70s. It's just like they have no sense of history or interest in it. When you hear things like, Joe Biden is the worst president in American history, it's like, or that Joe Biden's a communist, it's like, But by what metric? Like, look at Eisenhower. Eisenhower's marginal tax rates were like 98, like 91%. The amount of money that was being, seized by the government and by the right, if you want to call Republicans the right in your little binary, it's just really it makes me wince.
Habeas corpus was suspended by Lincoln, Wilson, and Roosevelt.
But you know what else? It's also funny. Like, Teddy Roosevelt's great, Wilson's terrible. It's just like the amount of mental ignorance you have to go through to say this claim with a straight face. It just beggars belief. You can make the argument that Teddy Roosevelt as a human being was infinitely better than Wilson, which is, I think, indisputably true. He was clearly a badass in many ways. Getting shot and finishing a speech, that's pretty cool. And Wilson's just a prick, and Roosevelt had a sense of humor. But in terms of their policies, that these are evil, these are great, it's just like you're insane.
Don't see a difference. I mean, Roosevelt was wildly racist and imperialist and he used those terms. He called himself an imperialist. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt, he was vicious dude. Let's talk about Reagan and Thatcher, though.
Sure.
Because your book does do a lot on them, and you have quite a positive view of them, at least in the book. And that,
in this context, yes.
Yeah, I mean, so that troubles me, but I wanted to ask you to explain this because I think you know where I'm going here. So you're an anarchist, anti-statist, anti-government, never met a politician you liked, except for apparently Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. So, I mean, I understand because they were diehard anti-communists.
Yes.
I get that part. And I agree with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. I am just as much an anti-communist as they were. But I mean, the way they approached it was building lots and lots of nuclear missiles and many tanks and drafting people into the army and putting military bases all over the world and and fighting peasants in Vietnam and El Salvador and killing lots and lots of people. So, I mean,
I don't think who they fight in Vietnam.
Oh, not Reagan and Thatcher, but their people. I mean, their parties. And Reagan was he was a politician in the 60s. He was pro Vietnam.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what I meant. I meant their ilk. I
think they both were very much outliers within their parties, as I talk about in the book. Thatcher certainly, to this day, has a very quixotic relationship with the Tories. They don't really know what to make of her historically. Reagan was, a loon. The establishment fought him fairly heavily, and the media certainly despised him. What I admire about him especially, you talk about those nukes, when they took him down to the bunker, he made the decision that if Russia nukes us, I'm not retaliating. This is to the left of McGovern. This is kind of crazy sense of pacifism, which I think is an enormous. One of Reagan's biggest accomplishments was when he sat down as president. He goes, "Okay, I'm putting a stop to the threat of nuclear war. It's absolutely crazy that I can push a button and kill tens of millions of people. We need to," and he wanted to, sat down with Gorbachev at Reykjavik. He's like, "We need to figure out a way to denuclearize the world." To me, that is as heroic, and he meant it. He clearly meant it. And Thatcher was just blowing a gasket because she called him insane or some words to that effect. And her point, which is also true, is you can't uninvent something. If something is created and you disassemble all of them, doesn't mean that they cease to exist. The technology is still there. And there's this great line where her mask drops, where she's like, "How do you know Gorbachev wouldn't cheat? I would cheat." So she knew, she was the cynic in this regard. So the fact that he was willing to sit down with Gorbachev and be like, let's demilitarize, the fact that he went to Red Square, and when he was asked in Moscow, "You call this country an evil empire?" And he's like, he hemmed and hawed. He goes, "That was a different time." It wasn't that different of a time. Mm-hmm. So these were just major. And the fact that, there's that whole parable about Nixon in China, because Richard Nixon was universally regarded correctly as such a anti-communist to the point where he was a red baiter, in a McCarthyist vein. Only someone with that much cred in anti-communist circles would have this political capital, pun intended, to go to Mao and raise a toast to him and make nice with China. If it was someone, in the middle of the left, they'd be eviscerated because it's like, you're soft on communism, so on and so forth. So the fact that they were so credentialed in terms of being such cold warriors, that gave them the space to be complete doves and be like, listen, if you guys are demilitarizing, we're not going to invade. We're not going to press this advantage. Let's all shake hands and work together. And they had an enormously successful working relationship. Gorbachev came to Reagan's funeral and so on and so forth. And I think that is, to me, politics. To me, politicians at their best is when someone has a huge gun and they take their hand off the gun. They're like, no, we're not doing this. We're going to figure out another way. And they, all three of them did that. They were all committed to that.
Okay. I guess it's just that, again, as an anarchist, to see a president who oversaw a massive growth of the state, right?
Sure.
I mean, the military, there were more nuclear missiles when Reagan was done than when he started, and a much larger military. We were spending much more money on the military than ever before.
This isn't an anarchist book.
No, I know that. But I mean, again, I'm wondering why you admire him, because...
Well, like I said, I admire someone who was instrumental in liberating half the world relatively peacefully.
Okay, well, I have to argue with you there.
Okay.
So you do credit Reagan with the liberation of the Soviet people?
Well, no, to some extent he was key, but okay. I think Gorbachev was probably the hero. Gorbachev, really? Rand was writing Atlas Shrugged. There's a character called the Wet Nurse, and she said he kind of wrote himself, and I never understood that. And as I was reading this research, I didn't realize to what extent Gorbachev was a hero. So I would credit Gorbachev far more than Reagan or Thatcher, certainly.
What about the Soviet people? What about the Hungarian people and the Czech people?
I don't think the people had as much power in these societies as they do in Western societies.
But they're the ones who made the revolution. They're the ones who walked away, refused to work in the factories, refused to participate in politics.
Sure, but they were not. They were also the ones who, it was the leaders who decided not to point guns at them. Because as I talk about in the book, especially in East Germany, they were desperate for another Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square was happening during this. They wanted to send the tanks. At one point in East Germany, they actually armed the military. There was going to be a protest, and they're like, all right, tonight it's going down. We're going to start shooting your moms and your dads and your sisters and your nieces and nephews and your kids. And the soldiers went back to their barracks crying, because they're like, all right, even if I tell my mom, I got to shoot somebody else's mom. And at the last minute, the order came in, okay, we're not shooting. Yeah, the people get credit, but you have to, I think, especially in these top-down economies, give more credit to the leaders who are choosing peace and nonviolence.
Are you talking about 91 when they did?
Yeah, 89 through 91, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so by then, though, I mean, it was so apparent that the vast majorities of people in the Eastern European countries were not interested in communism anymore. And
I don't think the leaders ever care what the majorities think. They just care about their power.
No, but they have to. I mean, when you're the king and your entire citizenry is against you, you have to do something. You can't kill everybody, right? You can't imprison everybody.
You can start. You could have a Tiananmen Square. Well, I don't think it's that hard. If they, like, you see this, I mean, look at Venezuela today. They just have their snipers. People protest. They just start picking people off. You don't have to kill everyone. You just have to have everyone afraid of being killed. But
I think there are far more people in Venezuela who are pro-government than there were in the Soviet Union who were pro-government as of 1991.
I'm not.
There's movements. I mean, there's popular movements within Venezuela who are pro-Chavez and Maduro. Like,
I'm not at all discounting what the people did, but I think the fact that it was peaceful was a function in these cases of the leaderships.
Well, okay. Yeah, again, I just would say it was like a mass resistance, a mass sort of passive resistance in the Eastern Bloc that made it impossible for them to use violence, because if they'd use violence, again, they would kill like a tiny portion of their opponents in the citizenry and it would ultimately backfire. So I think
that's crazy. I think a lot of times violence is very effective against the citizenry.
Hang on now, but wait a second. Do you think the Politburo of the Soviet leadership in the late 80s and early 90s did not shoot at the protesters because they were good men, because they were pacifistic, or because they have no choice? I
think they had a choice.
Okay, so they just made a good choice.
Yeah, because I think Gorbachev made a good choice. Yeah.
Right, but why do you think that's the question? Why do you think?
I think there's two reasons. Okay. I don't think they're contradictory. I think one, he thought it was the wrong thing, and he also was like, all right, this isn't gonna. I think he did the calculus, but there was that coup against Gorbachev as well, as I discuss in the book. So I mean, the idea that like. I don't like this line of thinking, because it's very much blames often the victims. Because if you look at a country where that is, oppressed, and there's certainly no shortage even today, it's like, well, all you guys got to do is just rise up. And if you're not, you're pussies. It's like, I don't think it's that simple.
Well, I mean, this is actually a very important point. Wouldn't you agree, though, that certainly for a lot of Soviet history, there were large portions of the population who were pro-communist, who
Yes,
were
of course.
and that's why the Soviet Union existed. It wasn't just because of Lenin and Trotsky, like winning a revolution, because they had a base of support in the
Absolutely, especially in the beginning.
Okay, so that tells me that like determinative numbers of Soviet citizens chose communism, and then later on they chose not. Well,
I don't think the masses are determinative at all.
Not at all.
No. Well, the slaves had the numbers.
The slaves had the numbers, not well, in certain countries they did, not here.
In the South, in the Confederacy.
No, never a majority. What do you mean? Not even close.
How many? If I'm a slave owner, I'm going to be outnumbered by my slaves, right?
No. I mean, there were most slave owners owned one or two slaves.
Sure, but okay. So if it's one or two, if it's sometimes it's one, so it's an equality. Sometimes it's two, so I'm outnumbered 2-1. And it's never going to be one. It's never going to be 3 slave owners and 1 slave. They're always going to be outnumbered.
Well, it wasn't just the individual slave owners; the entire class of slave owners and the government and the state that
sure,
supported them.
Yeah, but again, if you're saying that the population is determinative, the percentage of slave owners was as people who talk about the Civil War correctly always point out, it's not like the majority of Southerners were slave owners. Most of them were poor, or certainly the ones who fought were poor. The rich people weren't necessarily fighting as much. Sure. So by your logic, all of those slaves should have just rebelled, right?
Well, so this is this is funny that you say this, but I mean, my book, the second chapter, is about how slaves were quite pleased actually with their lives and thought of their masters as their fathers.
Some did, sure.
No, most did. And that we know that from testimonies from the slaves themselves. Lots of interviews were done. They had very positive memories of slavery. Not that it was paradise, but they preferred it to freedom. So that's why we didn't have a slave rebellion. In Jamaica, in Brazil, in Haiti, of course, totally different story. And this is where your point is totally appropriate. That greatly outnumbered the whites and the slave owners and even the members of the government. So this is why they were able to rise up and rebel and overthrow the slaveocracies in those countries. So again, though, that's to me the people being determinative. And I'm thinking through this. I'm not exactly sure what my position is, but I do think that the Bolsheviks, as of 1917 to 1924, when they're consolidating power, they needed large portions of the Soviet population to be with them. And I think that's what happened for quite a while.
They also, let's look at North Korea today. You also need to create a system where people can't get together and plan. Mm-hmm. So in North Korea, they do something they kind of got from Mao. They have, they call them criticism and self-criticism sessions. Right. I forget what the euphemism is in North Korea. Point being, everyone in that country is slotted into a group. It's your school, it's your neighborhood, whatever, it's your office. And once a week, you have to get up and say what you did wrong. And then I have to say, oh, I still thought Thad was late to work. And Thad has to apologize and make amends. Point being, in these systems, even if everyone was like, this sucks, if I see 2 people talking, I publicly will now report it in front of everyone. And now they're in trouble. Right. So even if they had the numbers, we got a real problem.
Sure.
In terms of trying to affect a revolution.
Right. But the story there to me is that a lot of people want to be cops. And that's true. A lot of people want to be cops.
But again, even in East Germany, the percentage of people who wanted to be cops, and I talk about this a lot, it's not a majority. It's just you need a small enough of a kind of a rump to kind of be the shepherds. Sure. One of the things that is relevant to contemporary thought is I was of the belief, and I think a lot of people are of the belief, that these informers were like, all right, I get arrested. They're torturing me. They're torturing my kids or my wife or whatever, my dad. And they're like, all right, give me the names of who you talked to about politics in the last week. And I'd mention your name in 2 seconds. They would have barely any pressure because I knew they're going to get it out of me. And I just got to give them as many names as possible. I was in the belief that, okay, all these people were kind of being blackmailed. And it's just like, all right, you got to work for us or else it's going to be under your family. Mm-hmm. What was disturbing to learn, and there's a book called Stasiland by Anna Funder. She's an Australian journalist. She met like an ex-Stasi recruiter. He goes, these people are just bored. Like, we didn't have to pay them a lot of money. There was no gun to their head. Right. It wasn't like, all right, if it's you or your neighbor, and of course people are going to pick their neighbor. They just want to feel important. They want to feel someone was listening to them. and they want to feel like they were buying into the system. And we saw that, I think, again with COVID. Now, let's assume that the COVID narrative is 100% accurate. You can't deny that there was no shortage of people tripping over themselves to boast on social media. I saw someone who wasn't wearing a mask. I turned in my colleague who wasn't being vaccinated. Right. Now, let's assume for the sake of argument that they were doing this for purely wholly good reasons. They were still very proud of themselves for it. They weren't like, you know what? it didn't make me feel good, but I had to turn in someone at work because they're endangering all of us. No. They're like, hell yeah.
Right.
I had a video early on in COVID. It was on my Instagram. I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but just seeing it's kind of shocking, where there was this Chinese dude, I'd say in his like 30s, Western dress. He wasn't like with a rickshaw. And some guy was standing over him on an empty subway train, berating him, like, go back where you came from. You're just in the most very xenophobic, racist ways, because the guy wasn't wearing a mask. And it's like, this is an empty subway car. If you're that concerned about him spreading COVID, why are you getting right in his face? Yell at him from, down the train. And then you realize it's not about COVID at all. Mm-hmm. This is about you having a sense of power over somebody else.
Completely agree. That's a particular personality, right?
No, I think it's a particular status. I think low status people who bring nothing to the table love to compete on obedience, because that's the only metric where they can outrank anybody else.
Yeah, but there's lots of low status people who don't act like cops.
It's just maybe they're in a position to.
Yeah. Well, so the question, I guess, is, though, those COVIDian people, those police, COVID police during the pandemic, if they were in Moscow, say, in the 1950s, yes, they would have been sending people to the gulag.
Do you have any doubt?
No. No, I just want to hear what you had to say about that. I mean,
no, not even. It's very. This is the other thing that Americans don't get. America's not magic. Like, the American mindset is different in many ways from the Soviet mindset, sure, and the British mindset, the German, Venezuelan. But there are certain commonalities that are universal to human beings.
Yeah.
And one of them is that people are more than happy to turn in their neighbors if it gives them a sense of status, a sense of morality, a sense of something.
If they're thinking that they're doing the right thing, if they think that Anne Frank is a parasite,
right,
they will do it.
Or just simply that they don't, not thinking about Anne Frank one or another. They know if they do this, they're going to be valorized.
Well, yeah, right. They're doing the right thing, the good thing. They're good people, right?
Like, if you train it, I always make this point. I say, if you want to study human beings, study dogs, because humans and dogs co-evolved. So if you train a dog to attack someone who crosses your threshold, the dog's not thinking, is this the right thing or the wrong thing? It just knows, this is what I'm supposed to do. If I do this, I'm rewarded. If the dog doesn't know, like, why you want to roll over. And frankly, there is no reason. Like, it benefits no one in any way for the dog to roll over.
But wait
it just
a minute,
knows, if I do this, I get a treat.
But wait a minute. I mean, I certainly agree with you in general about lots of people, but there's a lot of people who are not dogs.
Oh, no, sure. But I'm just saying, if you want to understand people, instead of reading like political science and be like, well, you have the Republican candidate, he puts forth this Enlightenment idea. You have this marketplace of ideas, and you have one candidate, he puts forth his point of view, and then the other candidate puts point of view, and you sit at home and you do your research, you make a reasoned decisions. This is completely fallacious and to the point of derangement.
Right.
Whereas dog psychology is far more analogous to how humans actually operate than that kind of Enlightenment mythology.
Would you say, like, the way the masses operate, or like most people? I mean, because of course,
I'd say most, yes. Like,
you're not a dog. I don't think I'm a dog in that way. I mean,
no, but I think like we're looking like 80%.
Yeah, no, then I'm completely agree with you. It's something like that.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm a dog lover. Like, dogs often they're good and they're kind, and they don't have to be told to help the kid. So this is not necessarily a negative entirely claim
for humans being automatically obedient to authority.
But also, that's the negative side. But the positive side is they also are kind and helpful, and often don't need to be told to do the right thing. And if they see someone drowning, they don't think twice, like, I got to save this person. It's not like, oh, too bad.
And there's no fighting with the dog. There's no arguing. There's no cajoling or coercing or telling them, would you please take out the garbage again?
Right.
Right. Would you please obey my rules again? Yeah. So I know this book was, for you, very moving and emotional.
Yes.
And I'd like for you to talk about that. Why that is. And I want to talk about some specific parts of the book that I think would be hard for anyone to read and not get emotional about. But why was this so? Was it because of your parents? Because of your background? Why'd you care so
No,
much?
I think when as if you and I sat down and thought of like being evil, right? We think of like, I have this example in the book. It's like Liam Neeson's tied to a chair and you're punching him in the face and you're like, where's the money? And he's like, fuck you. And he's spitting in your face. The things that these people did to children in huge numbers is something that, you know, if you and I sat down for a week and tried to think of like sinister things, it would never enter our heads.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And you know, I did some co-authoring in the past, and when I worked on those books, you try to put yourself into the protagonist's mind as best you can and work in their voice, right? So when you're reading about children being tortured, and what torture really means, and what is being done to knowingly innocent men and women, and you're trying to put yourself in their mindset to make that experience understandable, comprehensible to the reader, it's extremely disturbing. When there's just Peter Fechter is just like, I think some of the best writing I've ever done. He was an 18-year-old kid or 21, I forget. I think he was 18. Tried to flee crossing the Berlin Wall. You know, they shot him and he bled out for an hour and then he died. And the thing is, you have the video on YouTube and we have his picture. And when you just think about what that's like when you're sitting there at the base of the Berlin Wall for an hour bleeding, screaming for help, and then at a certain point you realize help's not coming and you just feel yourself getting weaker and colder, like that's extremely emotional. And it's just stories like this, you know, you know, there's that joke about how if one person's a murderer, it's a million, it's a statistic. There are enough anecdotes of specific individuals who had horrific, unimaginable things done to them in the sense that you and I would never imagine to do them, but they actually happened. And also to be the one to kind of save them from the dustbin of history is also kind of very emotional, to be like, hey, this is something that shouldn't be forgotten. This person, maybe they weren't going to be, you know, some kind of Einstein revolutionary, but this is someone who had, you know, life and values and had a future ahead of them. And it was destroyed for absolutely no reason. And just what people are capable of doing to one another it's hard.
Yeah. I mean, so I think I've said this to you. I've said it's many people. I was literally born an anti-Stalinist, anti-communist, because my parents were Trotskyists. You know, we can get into that later, but I was at least taught to hate the Soviet Union and all it stood for. And I've always hated it, you know, even since I stopped being a socialist, I've always hated it. So I just want to be clear about where I'm coming from here. But so there's a litany of horrors in your book that are all essentially true. You could quibble with some of the details, but there's just no doubt that all these people died, and in large part because of the Soviet system.
Yes.
But the thing is, that litany of horrors has occurred all over the world in every century. There's nothing new about people doing horrible things to other people in a mass scale.
I disagree.
And for instance, in this Germany, like at the same time, like, why didn't you write a book about the horrors of Nazism?
Because you can wear a hammer and sickle to school. You can't wear a swastika to school.
There it is.
And my buddy Curtis Yarvin made the point about which genocidal ideology should I be worried about, the one that lost or the one that won. So the fact that it's, sorry, I'm getting a little emotional. The fact that the Soviet Union is regarded as like a joke, like this kind of kitschy, like quirky, like, oh my God.
Well, not a joke. It's often regarded as like a pretty decent try at, utopia, right?
Right. Yeah. So when you just now, I was in, I think it was, I forget where it was, LA or it was Miami. And, you know, there's a brand of like Russian ice cream, and like all the packaging is just talking about like, oh, under Soviet system, the high quality, and it's just like being kind of tongue in cheek. And I'm just like, wow, like, you people are disgusting. You know what I mean? Like it's you laugh, but it's just horrifying to me. Yeah. And the other big difference is, and this is something that lefties can't get their heads around. There was never a big Nazi movement in the States.
Right.
The Klan went overseas to fight the Nazis. I made this point, and then you write, there are far more white supremacists fighting Hitler from America than there were urban feminists. Like, correct. It's not even a question.
Correct.
So, but for the other big point of this book, which was extremely disturbing to read, which you must have grown up with knowing, is to what extent everything every aspect of the Soviet Union was apologized for, defended, or swept under the rug by Western intellectuals and establishments, which are still in existence today.
Right.
That to me is what is this. I didn't realize to what extent they were explicit. Upton Sinclair, who I have a chapter on, who's still a great progressive hero, when he talks about how, yes, they starved millions of people, but look at it this way, they solved the problem of famine forever, which they hadn't. To see him say this in black and white is something that because we're used to nowadays people using euphemisms, you know what I mean? Or like, there were some problems with food distribution, you know, like to say it in writing explicitly, to lie to the American people and say they have free speech. The Soviets can read, Soviet citizens can read any book they want from Aristotle to Lenin. And it's just like, that is a big difference between the Soviet system and the Nazi system.
Yeah. So you just put your finger on why this has all been memory hold. It's because the people who write history, who keep official history, who remind us of what's important from history, we're all sympathetic to the Soviet fucking Union.
Yes, there's plenty of receipts to that in the book.
That's known. I mean, we've known, professors overwhelmingly in the social sciences and humanities for the last, 80 or 90 years have been at least warm toward the Soviet Union and communism.
Note that 30 years ago, the left took over the universities. Before that, they were all conservatives, right? Read your history.
Yeah, no. There were more, I know what you're saying. There were more sort of what we would call conservatives writing history in the 1940s and 50s, but there were also quite a few communists. In fact, outright communists. This is why there was a blacklist in academia, because there were so many communists writing history.
Right. And again, we're not using the word communist in the sense of I have a vague favoritism toward Marxist. Communists in the sense of the Soviet Union and specifically Stalin are the good guys and the society of the future. And the faster these dullards in America can understand this, the better off the world's going to be.
And the United States should become the Soviet states of America.
And a Soviet satellite.
Yep. Yeah. The United States should become just like the Soviet Union. This was their position. This is what they fought for. This is what the Rosenbergs did. This is what they worked in service of, doing espionage for the Soviet Union.
And what's the difference between Jim Crow and the gulags? Right.
Yeah. So, that's why, because a lot of people who are sympathetic to the Soviet Union and communism are the ones who have written the history. So of course they're going to memory hole. It's the reason we don't talk about Russiagate anymore on CNN.
I have a line in there that I was on the fence about including, and I'm very glad that I did. I don't want to spoil it because this is one of the most intense scenes, but basically one person was arrested fallaciously and they're being tortured in order to break, and they're refusing to break. And in all these cases, it's just like getting you to sign your confessions of formality. We know you're innocent. It's just a matter of, getting on paper. And so they brought in his daughter and raped her in front of him. And then I had the line about how I don't think this is who the New York Times was thinking of when they ran in, was a 2020 op-ed describing how women had better sex under socialism. That was the headline. And by the way, that headline article referred to Eastern Europe. It wasn't specific talking about like Sweden. So you would think that an outlet which has so much blood in his hand, covering up a genocide, the Holodomor, would be more kind of tactful about defending these systems, even 30 years after they've fallen, but they don't, because they have no shame or souls.
Yeah. Was this Walter Duranty?
Yes.
Yeah. So I wanted to introduce just a little note of
But it
caution.
wasn't just him.
No, I know. I want to introduce just a little note of caution about some of the stories that you might tell about the Soviet Union and communism. We know where I stand on this, okay? I'm 100% against the thing. However, you have to remember that a lot of these stories have been generated or passed down, depending on your point of view, by whom? By ideological enemies of the Soviet Union, and especially proponents of the American empire. Remember, the United States was officially hostile toward the Soviet Union during this time, and there was a whole army, there's a whole army of propagandists, you agree with this, who worked for the State Department and the Defense Department and the White House in major media for 70 years, saying nothing but terrible things about the Soviet Union, and any opportunity to find some story of a rape or killing
I didn't use those sources. Eleanor Lipper was my source when Henry Wallace went to the Gulag. She'd been a prisoner. She was a Swiss national. She was not an American. She was an eyewitness. Roy Medvedev was and remained to his death a communist. He was working within the Soviet Union. These people weren't State Department apparatchiks. Peter Fechter, who I just mentioned, who bled out for an hour, the footage is on YouTube. This isn't some kind of, and the thing is, with the problem with these organizations and even contemporary, why I'm hopeful about the future is if you don't have a monopoly on the microphone, it's a lot harder to maintain your narrative. Nowadays, if everyone has a cell phone with a camera on it, it's really hard to stage things in public if you could have that 360 view and beam it at the speed of light instantly to Twitter or Facebook or whatever, or Instagram. So that I think, so I agree with you that things have to be taken with a grain of salt. But when I went to specific stories like Stanislav Kosior or Peter Fechter or Eleanor Lipper, I did not at all rely on National Review types.
Okay, well, I think the bigger problem is when you use sources written by people who currently are engaged in propaganda against Russia. So your main source for the Holodomor famine is Anne Applebaum,
right?
Red Harvest. And you know what Anne Applebaum's been doing for years has been leading the charge against Putin and wants regime change in Russia and is an absolute propagandist, certainly at least when it comes to Ukraine and the Russian Federation. And it has been said by many that her book about the evils of Stalin in Ukraine is simply a pretext, a justification for going to war against Putin, who she posits as his descendant, that Putin is an extension of Stalin. This is the whole argument made by Russiagate people, by the anti-Russia posse, right? That Vladimir Putin, having been in the KGB, is simply a continuation of the Soviet Union, and that's why we must go to war with it, and we must seek regime change in it at all costs. So again, I'm sure she's right about much in that book, there's no doubt, but be careful though, because she is a propagandist operating currently.
Right, but the thing is, she wasn't my entire source, right? Okay. So you had Gareth Jones, who was a contemporary, who was an eyewitness at the time. There were many other people who were sources. I didn't just rely on an app on, and I agree with you that, we heard this about Syria, how if we don't go to Syria right now, there's going to be another genocide. Assad's another Hitler. He's gassing his own citizens, and there's going to be the Kurds. Like if we're not in Syria tomorrow, the Kurds are going to be exterminated. We didn't go into Syria as they wanted. The Kurds weren't exterminated. They just stopped talking about it. So I agree with you. You talked about how I don't talk about how this relates to present day. It's precisely for that reason you're discussing. These things are horrific, regardless of whether they have any relation to contemporary politics. And I leave it to the reader to take from it what they want and to apply it to contemporary times. But I resent enormously when I mentioned this in other interviews, like you had during the Bloomberg administration, Bloomberg was mayor of New York, and he banned large size sodas at like 7-Eleven. And Mike Huckabee, who had been governor of Arkansas at the time, said this is like North Korea. And it's like, I assure you, in North Korea, having too much soda is not a problem. So when people make these kind of glib parallels that every dictator is either Hitler or Stalin, it's insane. And there's no belief. You can't say with a straight face that if Putin conquered Ukraine tomorrow, again, Ukraine where I was born, that he would start intentionally starving millions of people. I don't think anyone believes this with a straight face. So for her to claim that this is analogous, I think the analogy fails when we're talking about millions of people living or dying.
Sure. I mean, no doubt. So, I mean, that's a difference, though, maybe of degree. I understand that a ban on soda is far cry from what Kim Il-sung has done to his people, but could it still be could they both still be on the spectrum of authoritarianism, right? And so that the ban on soda was just, on the other end of the spectrum, but it's still authoritarian, and the next notch forward is, further infringements on civil liberties.
Listen, if the slippery slope ends, that like the worst thing that happens is that you're not allowed to buy soda at 7-Eleven, that is amount of authoritarianism where I think would be an infinitely preferable situation to what we have now.
Yeah. And I'm thinking aloud on this, by the way, right now, as we're talking. So this is kind of your main political thesis, what we should do, what we should think about contemporary politics.
Well, I don't say should.
No, I'm saying I'm getting at what your thesis is, which is that it's not the Soviet Union, and it's not that degree of totalitarianism. We can change things. The people of the Soviet Union changed things for themselves, et cetera, right? So don't be pessimistic about this. society we live in. But I guess, haven't we seen an increase in authoritarianism, what you might even call totalitarianism, if not to the North Korean or Soviet level? It's still worse than it was. Yes,
we were all imprisoned in our homes. That is absolutely an increase in authoritarianism. Okay. Now, you might say that this is for a good reason, but the fact of the matter remains, it was illegal to leave your house, right? But the point isn't that this isn't as bad as the Soviet Union. The point is the Soviet Union was so much worse, but yet they lost.
Still lost.
So people have this idea that, you know what, it's gotten so bad, we can't win. It's like, we won when it got even worse.
Right.
And it was relatively, and I'm using the word very broadly, relatively effortless compared to what it could have been. It could have been, and it could have been absolute Tiananmen Square times 1,000. I mean, they did have nukes. They did have, trained people and snipers and so on and so forth. Sure. So that, I think, is a big takeaway, that the power to these people have this idea. This drives me crazy, conservatives, and this is very much a holdover of Cold War thinking, that the U.S. receded on the world stage. China's going to conquer everything. Building an empire is not cheap and it's not easy. It's not the thing that, like, if I'm China and I conquer Italy, that it's just gonna be like, all right, now they're all speaking Chinese and everything is fine. Like Vichy France saw this, like the levels of resistance to these countries, Afghanistan, these people are literate goat herders, and they took out both superpowers. So, this idea that it's just like a cakewalk for the Chinese or Russia or whoever else to conquer, it's not the case at all.
Right.
Or America.
Right.
Like if we're going to be conquering these countries and everything, they're just going to be speaking American and, watching Modern Family. No.
Right. So I guess is the argument that even if we did advance all the way to a level of totalitarianism like there was in the Soviet Union or North Korea, there would still be a great chance of overcoming it, right? And of there being a liberatory revolution, because that's what exactly what happened in Eastern Europe. Is that it?
I don't know if that, but I mean, history doesn't repeat, but it sure rhymes.
Yeah.
Hope doesn't mean something is likely to happen.
Right.
Hope means something is possible to happen.
Right.
And if this has happened in our lifetimes,
right,
there's no reason to say, well, it's impossible that it'll happen again.
Yeah, I 1,000,000,000% agree with you on this. So, because I believe in human agency, and I'm not a fatalist or determinist like certain people are.
But it's also the people in power are largely unimpressive.
I was going to go there next. Yes.
Yeah.
So the Soviet leadership, they weren't exactly brilliant intellectuals, although actually there's about this recent biography of Stalin? I haven't read it, but apparently it's about him as a public intellectual. And as I understand it, the argument is that he was quite impressive, not like a top level intellectual, but, a serious guy, at least more impressive than, say, Joe Biden.
Well, I mean, come on, that's
or Rishi Sunak, or maybe even Barack Obama. But I mean, this is part of your point, right? Is that the current leadership of our society is less than impressive.
You can't. Yeah, I mean, if you're gonna, you look at Stalin, you look at Brezhnev. You know what I mean? It's like night and day, or even Khrushchev. I think Stalin was more impressive in there because he had his roots when being a communist was marginalized. Right. You had to be on the edge. You had to have a commitment. You were an ideologue. You had to have this kind of.
You had to argue.
You had this worldview that was really kind of well thought out and coherent. But then once it becomes the establishment, then it just becomes a matter of talking points and just mouthing the platitudes and doing what you can to maintain your hold on power.
Exactly. But the thing is, I mean, again, I totally
That's
agree.
The other thing. It's like, this is so funny with these conservatives. It's like, do you really think Joe Biden cares about trans kids? Like, he's like a 90-year-old Catholic. Like, do you really think he cares about, you know what that is? There was this thing where he had a pride celebration at the White House, and he was talking about how it's important to have parents like affirming their kids' gender. And conservatives saw this from the speechwriter as a defense of these surgeries. But it's like, I would bet you literally all the money I have that Joe Biden, when he talks about affirming kids, thinks he means like being like, I'm proud of you being my son or daughter, and I support you. Like, that's what he thinks. Like, he has no idea what the fuck that means.
Well, So what do you think that means, though, about the power structure?
Well, I mean, I think it's very clear the presidency is in many cases a figurehead. They were bragging. If this were any other circumstances, it would be one of the biggest scandals in American history, and I'm not using that hyperbolically. When you had the military lying to the commander-in-chief Trump about our troops in the Middle East, and then all the members of the media were high-fiving, I'm like, guys, this in any other circumstance, you'd be like, this is a coup. The military acting independently under the clearly constitutional edict that the commander-in-chief is a civilian in charge of the military, and you can't go against him even if he's a complete asshole. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm. So the thing is, the Democratic Party controls all the institutions. Right?
I don't think that's true. I don't think it's necessarily the Democratic Party. I think it's people who are broadly speaking left, but they often are contemptuous of the Democratic Party.
Well, they all vote Democrat.
Well, some of them vote Green.
Well, I'm talking about the heads of CNN, MSNBC,
New
York Times, Washington Post, the universities, where the most powerful institutions are.
I don't think that I think they run the Democratic Party, not the Democratic Party runs them.
Oh, yeah, that's Curtis Yarvin's argument.
I can prove it to you in 1 minute.
Okay, let's do it.
Let's suppose during the Trump administration, I was a Democratic congressperson, right? I thought Trump was a white supremacist. I thought he was praising very good people both sides of Charlottesville. Mm-hmm. He's guy's a putz. He's a philanderer. There's no way this guy should be anywhere near Washington, D.C., let alone the Oval Office. This is my belief as a Democratic congressperson, right? Mm-hmm. At the same time, I don't think he's colluding with Putin. I think these claims that he's some kind of Russian puppet are crazy. If I went on, talked to my constituents or on Twitter or on CNN said these things as a Democratic, I'd be eaten alive because their viewers had heard 24/8 Trump Russia collusion, Trump Russia collusion, Trump Russia collusion. So you see who's who's the dog and who's the tail.
Well, what about the monopoly on violence that the state holds, that the government holds, that ultimately they get to decide what we're allowed to say because they have all the guns?
Yeah, but it's a lot closer to Brave New World than 1984, don't you think? I think corporate America does a far better job of manipulating and guiding how people behave than Washington, D.C., which is very ham-fisted.
Right. But but the thing is, like, for instance, the CIA, we know, has been instructing every newspaper in the country since the 1950s to say particular things about foreign policy, right? And foreign leaders like Putin and Stalin and whatever. But and we know this. We know the newsrooms basically take orders from the CIA.
They don't deny it.
Okay, right. So, but that tells me that the CIA runs that.
Sure, but I don't think the CIA and like Congress are. I think they're almost different. They're different agencies, and they operate very differently. The CIA is not in any claim a democratic or really accountable. It's not like a Department of Health and Human Services, where Donna Shalala is the secretary, and you can kind of get the secretary out of there, and they can affect policy. I think it's like the Fed. I think they largely operate completely independently of Congress and other agencies.
Yeah, no, but it's just the state. That's all, not the media. No, I'm saying it's the state, though, an agency of the state that's calling the shots. There,
sure, but I also think that in that case, I think that's correct. Yes.
But in a way, is this sort of even worth having this conversation or this argument? Because don't they just sort of operate as
it's like one? A snake eating its own tail.
They operate as one anyway. This New York Times and the State Department are the same entity. Their children are all the same. They all go to the same schools. They're from the same neighborhoods. Right. They have this exact same worldview. They read the same things. What's the difference?
Right.
But ultimately, if it came down to it, which it's not, but if it came down to it and there was some sort of revolt from the media against the government, who would win that, though, right?
I don't know.
The government has the guns, so they would shut down the media.
But you just said how the people have the power to kind of overthrow.
They would attempt to. So what would determine who wins that fight is where the people are. Are the people with the media or with the government? I think
what would determine who wins that fight is how honest or how bad the argument was, right? If you have a case where the CIA is literally like engaging in human child sacrifice and there's videos and so on and so forth, it's going to be hard to defend. But if if they are just can hand wave anything away under the rubric of national security, it's amazing what they can get away with. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's obvious beforehand who would win that situation. They're both possible.
Okay. So what is the path forward? I'm sure you've been asked this before, but the book, as I said, there's really no mention even of contemporary politics. It is it is only a history, which is not to say it's small, it's a huge story, but it's only a history of communism in the 20th century. So, but it is called the white pill. And I think the last page, you say something about how this should be a lesson to us to not be pessimistic because the people of Eastern Europe wrote.
I don't say should.
They found
don't you otherwise say we should not?
No, I never use that term.
Pessimistic or
no. I don't say that at all. I say this is the case for hope.
Gotcha.
And people can take it or disagree if they want.
You have moralized against cynicism, though.
Yes, because cynicism is indefensible in the sense of hopelessness.
Okay, well,
because as long as there's one data point to the contrary, your argument's defeated.
So we should not be hopeless.
You cannot, with a straight face, look at the data and be hopeless, in my opinion.
100%. Now, the thing is, that argument seems
on a personal or a political level.
Yeah, that argument seems unimpeachable. And it's just got so much evidence in your book to back that up. I don't know how you could avoid that. However, I mean, I guess I've been thinking, so we're in the United States in 2023 now. We're not in Moscow or Leningrad in 1991. Very different society, very different government, very different state, very different culture, very different people, very different leadership.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, I mean, do you make predictions? It would be totally legitimate to not make any predictions. I get that. I think it's dangerous. But I mean, do you see I guess what is the way out other than just not being pessimistic? I mean, that you don't want to just say that alone, do you? Is there more to be said than just there is hope?
Well, I think, like you talked about earlier with Samus data, the fact that information and the control and supply of information has become as decentralized almost as possible. Yes, sure, people can be kicked off social media and silenced to some extent. They even couldn't shut up Alex Jones, who still has a very big audience. Mm-hmm. The fact that think about it this way, if it was the 1930s Ukraine and everyone had cell phones and access to power, if it was Germany, in the 40s, because there was a lot of because one of the things people need to appreciate, and you know this very well, is there was a lot of skepticism about Nazi atrocities, because during World War I, we heard about the Kaiser and the Hun were the worst people ever, and they're nailing babies to doors and all this other stuff. That stuff turned out to be propaganda. So when 20 years later, 30 years later, you're hearing the same thing about the Nazis, like, okay, we heard all this. But if there were video cameras everywhere on their phones and you had all this footage, this huge flow of information, it would be very different than having to rely on an intermediary, a reporter who has an agenda, who works for a corporate entity to, talk about this story or not that story. And that's one of the reasons I am personally hopeful, because when you have access to information, which is truth, it's a lot harder to manipulate and to control, because I'm not relying on you. And here's the other thing, there's a big asymmetry, because if I tell you 10 truths and one lie, it's not like you look at me as like 90% truthful. You look at me as a liar. So as soon, and this is like a kind of a straw that breaks the camel's back, it's different for every individual. And some people will never reach this point, nor do they have the capacity. But at a certain point, many people realize, oh, the corporate press isn't just making mistakes. They're not sloppy. These Ivy League graduates aren't all stupid, which is just it's insane. They're not all, they all lack common sense. You realize, these people are very bright. Some of them have an agenda. They are consciously and knowingly lying. The one of the scenes in the book, which I love, which I'm confident you like as well, is when Yeltsin, who was very, very high up in the Soviet Union, who succeeded Gorbachev.
His trip to the States?
He was in Houston. He went to NASA. After that, he goes, let's just check out a supermarket. And I went to that supermarket, it's still there. I took photos there. Wow. And I did the exact pose Yeltsin did. And he's looking around and he sees these are like janitors, school teachers. These aren't dignitaries. And he'd never seen so much food in a supermarket in his life.
Right.
He sees that it's just regular people, stuff that he who goes to the special stores in the Soviet Union can't get access to.
Right.
And it's just this great moment where he's flying back to Moscow and he's sitting on the plane with his head in his hands. And he's like, they had to lie. Like they had to lie to the people, because once they understood what was going on, they wouldn't accept it. And that realization that you're part of a system that keeps literally tens of millions of people cold and hungry just to maintain its own power for literally no other reason, that is such a mind fuck. So I think that was a major figure with a major mind fuck. But I think that happens on a day-to-day basis in this country. It's like poker. At a certain point, you're like, I'm out. Like, you're like, I've reached my limit. These people are not just making mistakes. They're not dumb. And this isn't something that's new. This has been going on for a very, very long time.
Yeah. So, I mean, I had a similar optimism about the internet. And
hope and optimism aren't the same.
Okay. Tell me.
Well, optimism is like, it's likely to happen. Hope is like it's possible that it'll happen.
Yeah. Okay. So hope is what you have.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I was hopeful about the internet and, the new modes of communication, granting everyone all this freedom to access to information, all this stuff, until 2016. And since 2016, I have seen how certainly Americans and actually many Europeans have used the internet and made, I think, my world worse and less free. Less free. I mean, I think there's more totalitarianism on the internet now than there was in 2016 because Trump made everybody go authoritarian.
I can't think of the last time someone was canceled. When's the last time someone was canceled in your head?
Like legitimately, like really canceled?
That doesn't really happen much anymore. I know this is kind of like heresy to say because the whole narratives that conservatives are being persecuted, but like Milo, even Kanye wasn't canceled.
True.
To the extent where canceled in the sense of this person has been vanished from social media and you can't hear what they have to say anymore. That used to happen all the time. And now it doesn't happen.
There's lots of people who are still banned from Twitter though, aren't there?
But what I'm saying is, who are the new ones?
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe they just cleared out all the bad people early on.
I don't think they did. I'm still around.
Wait, hold on. But this is a huge thesis or hypothesis you're putting forward. You're saying that the cancellation trend is ebbing?
I'm saying I'm not sure I'm comfortable saying that, but I'm saying I can't think of the last big scale cancellation in the sense that a person has been effectively silenced. Like Milo's been banished.
Ali Alexander.
She's still on Twitter.
Is he really?
Yes.
Wow, but he's persona non grata within the Republican Party, isn't he?
Well, there was that article in Daily Beast about him with the pedo stuff,
that's what I mean.
But that's not a function of like he had a mean tweet and then he's been banished from the face of the earth.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I hope that's true. We'll see. I haven't seen like any like racist hunting going on lately. Right. They used to happen every day, but not anymore.
Like, here's another one. I honestly think if this was 2016, 2017, J.K. Rowling would have been banished. Right? Because she's probably first and foremost about like, this is the left's version of conversion therapy. Right. This idea that if I'm a literal murderer or rapist, I can just say that I am a female and I'll be locked in a cell with other females, and that this is something that's not even to be discussed. It's just like, you're a bad person if you have any skepticism about this. If this was the trans issue wasn't as prominent 5 years ago, but if the dynamics were 5 years ago, now what they were 5 years ago, she'd be gone.
Yeah. No, I think so, right? I think that's right. Yeah. Last question. I've been curious when I was reading the book, I was curious how like your audience or sort of the broader audience was taking it. And I'm interested in the level of interest. First of all, again, it's a fairly straight history book, yes, which is what I do. So I have a dog in this fight. I want books like that to be popular and I want people to be interested in them mostly, right? How interested are people in the history of communism in the 20th century?
But the thing is, it's, as you know, and not that you're claiming to the contrary, the story is much broader than this.
Sure.
It's not just literally history of communism. It's also about how bad can get, both on an individual level, how evil, and also just the dynamics in these countries.
Yeah.
And also how long this has been going on for, and also how much blood is on the hand of all these Western apologists. So there's lots of, smaller narratives than the broader straight history one. Mm-hmm. The sales are very high. The reviews are very positive. And I think what I am delighted about with the book is that once you see the face of evil, and the subtitle is A Tale of Good and Evil, and I do use that word, I know you're a little uncomfortable with it. Mm-hmm. You can't unsee it. Once you see your dad beating the crap out of your mom, you will never look at him the same way, ever. Mm-hmm. And once you see what the New York Times and all these agencies did and what was being done to particularly children and innocent women, and you're like, all right, then you also realize, okay, these people aren't messing around. Like, it's not like, it's not, if the worst thing totalitarians did is that you're kicked off social media, that might be a net positive for you, because you're going to have better like a sense of self, better contentment. You're going to be productive, but it's not at all the word. And right. One of the reasons I was inspired by this book is I was on the Blaze one day and they were calling Biden a communist. And I'm like, do you guys even know what being communist is? Like, he's a corporate party hack. And then I thought to myself, you know what? I don't even really know what it is, right? Like, what actually happened? Like, how bad did it get? What did they actually do? And when you read about it, you're just like, the creative sadism of the Russian mind is something that Americans thankfully have been ignorant of. And this is why it starts with Ayn Rand testifying in front of the House Un-American Activists Committee, where she's like, I can't explain to you what it's like to live in a totalitarian dictatorship. And in a good way, it's good that you can't even imagine what it's like.
Right. Let's not go there.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's next, man? What's your next project?
I am giving myself an opportunity to relax. Well, this was like 2.5 years. I still can't read it without crying. So it's good to be able to sit on my ass and be like, you know what, give yourself some time.
It's a ton of work, that book.
But it's just there's just the one scene or early, because you know this perfectly well, probably from your upbringing, this whole good Lenin, bad Stalin thesis, that Lenin's the good guy and Stalin corrupted it. Yep. And it certainly, Stalin corrupted certain things. It became less ideologically driven. But, you know, there's this story early on how they would round up these like homeless kids in Red Square and drive them around and be like, who are you working with? And the kids, they're homeless little street thieves. They don't have anyone. So they take them back to the Lublanka and beat the shit out of them. And then they take them out and the kids are like just pointing at anyone. And then they bring them back and the prisoners are going crazy because these men, hardened criminals, hear the kids screaming and crying. You read about this and it's the kind of thing I'm never going to be able to tell that story and in a dispassionate tone.
Lenin and Trotsky were utterly vicious.
Yes.
Profoundly violent men. And when I found that out, that's when I ditched socialism and my parents' politics because they were Trotskyists. And I found out.
And they boast, it's not like this isn't some kind of anti-Apple-bound propaganda. They constantly talked about terror, blood. 100%. We will, if you kill one of us, we'll kill 100 of you. Listen, if we kill innocent people, when you're chopping wood, sometimes chips fly. That was the quote. So they were just like, fuck you. Better to kill 10 innocent people than to let one counter-revolutionary live.
Awesome. And the part of the book that makes me cry, and I've read this story many times, and I've heard the story many, many times. And I'm going to say this to the audience. Please go get Michael's book. And if you're going to read nothing in it except one thing, read the Kronstadt Rebellion. The story of the Kronstadt Rebellion, which was anarchists, basically, Bolshevik. They were sailors and soldiers in the Russian military right after the revolution.
Heroes of the revolution per the Soviets.
During the Civil War, revolution, whatever. Yeah. So, but they're working for the Bolsheviks, but then they turn against the Bolsheviks and demand basically freedom, civil liberties.
No, they demand what the Bolsheviks promised them. Let's be clear, right? It wasn't like they were just like, all right. They were promised these things. They're like, all right, the Civil War's over. Let's deliver what you promised.
And my parents' hero, Trotsky, did what? He wanted their death.
He had an order ready to gas them.
Right.
They came in, they butchered them, and not only did they butcher them, you spoiled the story. The ones who fled to Finland, they said, come back, all be forgiven. And as soon as they came back, they got either shot or sent to the concentration camps.
Hundreds of men. Yep. Anarchists, freedom lovers. Yes. Shot dead by the Bolsheviks at the beginning of the revolution too, when it was full of promise for freedom for the working class of the world. Yeah. So if nothing else, read that story. Michael, thank you for writing this book. It was great to revisit a lot of these stories I knew about, and I also learned a lot of details I didn't know about before. And yeah, man, of course, we need people to know about that history so that we don't repeat it.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Or rhyme it, as you said.
Yes.
All right, man. Thank you.
My pleasure.
This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To become a patron of the show and have access to bonus episodes, AMAs, and the Unreported News Analysis Show, go to patreon.com/unregistered. Thanks for listening.